Faith rarely disappears in a single moment. It doesn't shatter like glass or burn out like a candle. It thins, it fades, it unravels from the inside, thread by thread, until the fabric that once held a person together feels unfamiliar in their hands. People often believe they've lost something sacred, something external. But according to Carl Jung, the disappearance of faith is not the collapse of a belief system. It is the collapse of a relationship with the deepest layers of the psyche. Most people are taught faith before they ever encounter themselves. They inherit it as a child inherits a surname. It becomes the scaffolding around the developing personality. It offers orientation, a story, a sense of belonging. Faith is not only belief in something unseen, it is belief in the idea that the universe has meaning, that one's life fits into a larger pattern, that there is moral structure, spiritual continuity, psychological safety. But Jung observed something rarely acknowledged. If faith is never personally discovered, it cannot be personally sustained. People lose borrowed faith easily. People lose unconscious faith inevitably. Doubt begins not as rebellion, but as confusion. It begins as a quiet tremor under the surface of a person's inner life. A moment when something they were taught does not match something they have lived. The psyche is extraordinarily sensitive to contradiction. Jung believed the unconscious mind reacts to every violation of inner truth, even when the conscious mind tries to ignore it. A person may suppress questions, silence discomfort, and insist they still believe, but the psyche keeps score. Jung used a powerful image. What you resist persists. Doubt accumulates pressure. It gathers in the shadows like unswept dust. The more a person pushes it away, the more urgently it demands attention. When the gap between inherited belief and lived experience grows too wide, the bridge collapses. Not because the belief was false, but because the person has changed while the belief remained static. This is why, Jung said, the loss of faith often feels like the loss of the self. The faith collapses, and the self collapses with it. The truth is that both were tied together from the beginning. But what exactly collapses? Jung explained that every person forms an inner God image, a psychological symbol, not necessarily religious, representing the highest order of meaning, certainty, and authority in their life. For some, this symbol aligns with a deity. For others, it becomes an ideology, a worldview, a leader, a scientific truth, or even their own ego ideal. The God image gives order to chaos. It frames the world in a comprehensible way. When it breaks, the psyche enters what Jung called a symbolic death. People do not fear the loss of faith itself. They fear the void that follows. People do not fear the loss of faith itself. They fear the void that follows. When certainty dissolves, the world becomes larger, darker, more complex than before. The mind loses its previous orientation. It begins to feel unanchored, psychologically weightless. Jung described this as being swallowed by the unconscious. The old story no longer holds, but a new story has not yet formed. This is the phase most people mistake as failure, decline, or spiritual defeat. But Jung insisted that this collapse is a necessary part of psychological growth. The old God image must die for a more authentic one to emerge. Why then does doubt feel so painful? Because the ego, the conscious identity, clings to the familiar. The ego lives by control, clarity, and stability. Faith provides those things. Faith is the ego's lifelong ally, until it isn't. When the unconscious mind begins calling for change, for evolution, for deeper contact with one's inner world, the ego experiences doubt as a threat. It tightens its grip. It insists on the old story, even when the psyche demands a new one. The tension between the ego and the unconscious becomes unbearable, and the person experiences this conflict as existential anxiety or spiritual crisis. Jung observed that people rarely lose faith because of arguments or logic. Faith does not collapse from intellectual criticism alone. People do not abandon their deepest beliefs because they read a book, saw a documentary, or heard a debate. Jung believed faith collapses when it no longer holds psychological truth for the person who carries it. When it becomes disconnected from the living reality of their inner life. People lose faith when life outgrows their old definition of meaning. This often begins with suffering, a loss, a betrayal, a moral conflict, a shift in identity, a discovery that parts of oneself, desires, fears, instincts, wounds, do not fit within the old framework. Jung insisted that suffering has meaning, not in a sentimental way, but in a psychological one. Suffering forces the unconscious to the surface. It pushes a person into confrontation with themselves. It reveals truths the ego would rather avoid. And one of these truths is that certainty can no longer be maintained. Jung wrote that the unconscious is not chaotic, it is purposeful. It pushes us away from beliefs that no longer serve our individuation, that lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness. The psyche will dismantle anything that blocks authentic development, even if that thing is sacred to the ego. People lose faith because the psyche wants them to grow. Yet the loss of faith does not occur uniformly. Some people experience a gradual fading. Others experience a violent rupture. Others undergo an agonizing period of oscillation, swinging between belief and disbelief like a pendulum that never settles. Jung saw these patterns not as flaws, but as stages in the transformation of consciousness. The gradual fading occurs when the unconscious gently withdraws energy from the old God image. The belief becomes less vivid, less emotionally charged, less compelling. It is like watching a statue slowly erode. The person may not even notice at first. They may still speak the same words, attend the same rituals, hold the same identity, but the inner fire has dimmed. These individuals often lose faith quietly, sometimes without ever acknowledging it out loud. The violent rupture happens when the ego and the unconscious have been in conflict for so long that the psyche reaches a breaking point. This often coincides with trauma, disillusionment, or a profound personal crisis. When rupture occurs, the collapse of faith feels like the collapse of the universe itself. Everything becomes destabilized at once. Jung described this as the catastrophic invasion of the unconscious. A sudden flooding of questions, fears, symbols, and unresolved emotions. The oscillating pattern is perhaps the most painful, A person in this state lives between two worlds, one foot in belief, one foot in doubt. They cannot return to their old certainty, but they are terrified to move beyond it. Jung saw this as a sign of psychological tension that has not yet found resolution. The ego keeps trying to rebuild the old structure while the unconscious keeps tearing it down. The person may interpret this as weakness or failure, but Jung regarded it as a profound inner struggle for truth. At the core of all these patterns lies one essential fact. The psyche seeks balance, truth, and wholeness. Faith that becomes rigid, outdated, or disconnected from reality becomes a psychological obstruction. The unconscious will not tolerate it indefinitely. Doubt is the unconscious correcting an imbalance. Jung believed that modern people in particular face a crisis of faith because modern life has severed our connection to symbolic meaning. Rationalism, materialism, and the pace of contemporary life have eclipsed the inner world. We live in an age of information, not transformation. We know more facts and fewer truths. We have more data and less meaning. The psyche becomes dehydrated. Jung argued that people do not lose faith because they are too rational. They lose faith because they are spiritually starved. Their inner life has been reduced to concepts, arguments, and abstractions. But meaning cannot be downloaded or intellectualized. Meaning must be lived from within. As a result, many modern individuals experience what Jung called a spiritual vacuum. They feel empty, not because they lack belief, but because they lack inner connection. They no longer know how to engage the symbolic dimension of life, the realm of myth, archetype, dream, ritual, and imagination. When the connection to this dimension weakens, faith becomes brittle, superficial, performative. Doubt then becomes the psyche's attempt to break through the surface and reach deeper layers of meaning. So what does the psyche seek when it dismantles faith? What emerges after the collapse? According to Jung, the disappearance of old belief is not nihilism, it is preparation. The psyche clears space so a more authentic form of meaning can arise. This new meaning is not borrowed, not imposed, not inherited. It is discovered through inner experience, through dreams, introspection, symbolic encounters, emotional truth, and confrontation with the shadow. The shadow plays a crucial role in the loss of faith. The shadow contains everything we deny about ourselves: anger, sexuality, fear, ambition, weakness, longing, wounds, contradictions. Faith often attempts to regulate the shadow by suppressing it, but suppression never works. The shadow always returns, stronger for having been denied. When a person begins confronting their shadow, the old God image often fails to hold. The belief system that once offered stability can no longer contain the complexity of the self being revealed. People do not lose faith because they encounter evil or temptation. They lose faith because they encounter themselves. The process of confronting the shadow often brings the person face to face with doubts that were always present but never acknowledged. Doubts about who they are, what they desire, what they fear, what they believe, what they cannot believe. Jung insisted that shadow work is not about rejecting one's old beliefs, but about integrating the truth of one's inner life. Sometimes this integration strengthens faith, sometimes it transforms it, sometimes it dissolves it entirely. Yet Jung did not view the disappearance of faith as a tragedy. He viewed it as a stage in the development of the self. the deeper, wiser, more complete center of the psyche. The self is not the ego. It is the wholeness within a person, the union of conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, belief and doubt. The self seeks authenticity, not comfort, not conformity. The self guides the psyche toward what Jung called individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming who you truly are, not who you were told to be. Losing faith is often the first major step in this process. It marks the moment when the ego realizes it cannot cling to inherited truths. The psyche demands personal truth. This demand can be terrifying. It feels like walking into darkness without a map. But Jung argued that only in this darkness can the psyche reveal its own light. What emerges after faith disappears varies for each person. For some, a more mature spiritual understanding arises, one that embraces paradox, symbolism, and mystery rather than dogma. For others, meaning emerges through creativity, art, relationships, or service. Some discover inner guidance in dreams and intuition. Others find grounding in philosophical inquiry or psychological insight. Some become more religious, others less so. But in either case, the relationship is now authentic because it is chosen, not inherited. Jung believed that the greatest danger in losing faith is stopping halfway, falling into cynicism, nihilism, or permanent disorientation. Doubt is meant to be a passage, not a destination. The psyche does not dismantle one meaning system unless it intends to replace it with another. But the new meaning cannot be forced or rushed. It emerges organically through introspection, symbol, intuition, and the slow work of psychological integration. The key, Jung said, is to listen. Listen to dreams, to emotions, to conflict, to discomfort, to the images that rise unbidden from the unconscious. Listen to the part of oneself that speaks in metaphor rather than argument. Listen to the truth that steps forward when the ego finally becomes quiet. Jung often said that modern people do not need better beliefs. They need deeper experiences. They need encounter, not explanation. They need symbolism, not certainty. They need meaning that grows from within rather than being handed down from without. This is why losing faith does not mean losing the capacity for meaning. It means shedding a skin that has grown too tight. It means entering a wilderness where the old paths no longer guide, but where new ones can be discovered. It means facing the terror of uncertainty so that a more authentic form of certainty can one day emerge. People imagine that faith is the opposite of doubt, but Jung understood something more subtle. Doubt is the catalyst that transforms belief into conviction. Without doubt, faith remains childish. With doubt, faith, if it survives, becomes conscious, mature, and personal. And if the faith that emerges is different from the faith that collapsed, that difference is not a sign of betrayal, but of growth. At its deepest level, Jungian psychology teaches that faith disappears for a reason. Not because the universe is empty, not because life is meaningless, not because the person has failed. Faith disappears because the psyche is calling for a new relationship with the truth. Faith disappears not when people lose God, but when they lose themselves. And it reappears when they rediscover the self. Doubt is not the enemy of meaning. It is the doorway through which meaning enters. The loss of faith is the psyche's way of clearing out space for a more authentic encounter with the mystery of existence. It is the threshold between who you were and who you are becoming. And if you follow the thread of doubt all the way through, you do not end in darkness. You end in deeper understanding, both of the world and of yourself. In Jung's view, the loss of faith is not a fall from grace. It is a step toward psychological wholeness, a step toward the kind of truth that cannot be borrowed, cannot be inherited, and cannot be taken away. A truth that rises from the depths of your own being.